Hey there, grade 12 art class. Sorry I can't be at class today. I wasn't around and available to be in the building today. So I'm doing today's lecture lesson um, as, an online lesson that you can get on Power School or D2L later. And you can review what we're going to do for the lesson. Really, this is an extension and a continuation of what we've been talking about, but like a further exploration of where we've been going in the last, I guess, few weeks. In our drafting and drawing classes, like when we're actually working on art in the practical classes, we've really been like exploring different types of artwork, um, and the techniques they use and the kind of ways they like to portray things, imagery, icons, to have an emotional reaction from you as the viewer, as the student. And then we're working on how we can use that sort of iconography and symbolism in our sort of drawings. Um, on the more theory side of it, where we're doing our exploration and viewing different artists um, and things, we last week we were really trying to discuss and figure out what is art. We've done art since we were kids, right? Ever since you were little, you would grab a piece of chalk and you would draw something, or you'd use your finger paints and you would paint something. Um, and there's all sorts of different reasons for art, and and sometimes you know we explored that, right? So we went through and we started to list all of them. We saw things like fine art or commercial art or kids art or student art or indigenous art, and there's all sorts of different reasons for that art, and there's a different influences on what makes that art be that art. And a lot of times we'll call those cultural influences. So for us, we have cultural influences around us all the time, right? Like we have, music, technology, all sorts of stuff that influences how we do things. Like you can see around here, around my office, I have Gundams, which are all anime, which is modern cultural influence. Here's my car. That's my favorite, like, car. Hard to see stuff. My favorite hockey players over here. These are all cultural influences that influence who I am and the sort of things that I like and the sort of things that I generate. There are all sorts of examples too of what we call commercial art. Um, Often not what we like associate with what we would say is great art. Um, and so I just wanted to talk about that a little bit. I was thinking about this the other day. I was thinking about what we would call the best art, and I've seen it when you guys have memes and stuff online, and when I'm watching my hockey, a great play will happen and there will be like this shot that you'll see, it'll be like an iconic shot from the game or something. And someone will comment up there, hang it in the Louvre. And I'll see that all the time. And it's kind of because we think of the Louvre as the pinnacle place where the best art goes, right? If you've got a picture in the Louvre, you've done pretty good. I mean, you're probably dead already, because generally people who are alive can't go there and say, I've had my art there. It's a lot of people who are, internationally famous for their art. They're the best of the best. The artwork that I will discuss here today, because we all know it and it's easy to discuss without having it on hand, the Mona Lisa, that's hanging in the Louvre. And that has, right, like if you think about it, its own cultural influences on it. If I think about Leonardo da Vinci, right, what do I know about that guy? He was a pretty good painter, right? And he lived in an era of really good painters, people who did really photorealistic stuff. Um, the, you know, the best art of its day was the stuff that was done technically really well. Like when you look at the Mona Lisa, the use of the paint and the way he uses emotion still carries over now. When people go to see that at the Louvre, they're still moved by how well that's done, right? And how well Leonardo da Vinci did that artwork. Okay. But like when I think about Leonardo da Vinci, I also know that like he had time to do that stuff. That was his sort of job. he did some like invention stuff and he did some other stuff, but it was like he had a lot of time and he was paid to do that sort of work, right? So his job was to every day get better at that stuff, right? He had access to really great materials. He had access to really great paints, really great teachers, other peers that he could work with and discuss different cultural trends with. Um, some of the big things that he worked on while he was alive, like he was one of the first guys to work on things like autopsies and painting bodies in different stages of decay and different states that medical journals were able to learn from and use. Um, and so that Renaissance was a huge influence on that guy's painting. But now, in turn, that painting's a huge influence on our culture. Um, Leonardo da Vinci himself is from Italy, right? But the Louvre is in France, right? So, culturally, interestingly enough, the Mona Lisa is part of the French national collection. Even though the Italians would love to have it back, and Leonardo da Vinci is from Italy, that doesn't matter. This is part now of the French national collection. So this also talks a little bit about colonialism and how we move around the world and we gather things to ourselves that aren't even necessarily ours, but reflect and portray what we want to, which is like, in this case, an ownership of the greatest piece of art. Having that piece of art in the Louvre makes the Louvre the Louvre. In comparison to that, you can walk up a trail not far from where I am here in Cochrane, up in Grotto Canyon, and you can see indigenous art that's been painted there on the wall, and where you won't see thousands of people a year going to see it, the impact is still huge, right? You're still connecting with a piece of art that was painted thousands of years ago, right? Or hundreds of years ago. I don't know the artist personally, but I can assume that that artist had much less time, for example, to create that art than Da Vinci did, right? Probably had to create their own materials to make the art. Never had a teacher, never had art classes, but probably didn't really care whether it was good enough to go in the Louvre or not, right? There were different cultural influences for why that indigenous person would want to paint different symbology and iconography in that location. And it was that location. That location was important to that person. And so they did that artwork there. So whereas Da Vinci's artwork has made the Louvre an important place, we can say the same thing about the indigenous art who've been put there for thousands of years that has now made Grotto Canyon an important local place here. What I would like you to do today is to split into your groups of 4 like we've used before, and we're going to start to sort of like role model what it would be like to be each of these artists in a section. I would like you to take one item from the list, okay, that we've created in your group, and I would like you to take a chunk of it. Each student will take one artwork and they're going to work out some of the things that they think would be cultural influences, just like what I've done here. Then as a group, I want you to get back together with those 4 different artists and start to compare what sort of cultural influences really matter. In the generation of art, in the creation of art. There's some specific questions there that I've given you that you can start to work through. And then as a group, I'd like to come back and discuss, okay, so now we've got all these different types of art. What are all the cultural influences on these types of art? And how does that create different ways of thinking and different movements and stuff like that? And we'll keep moving towards a greater understanding and a greater appreciation of the different ways of doing art and the different ways of thinking about art. And that's really the critical part. So everyone head off, go into your groups of 4. Once you've done that, come back and click on the next video and we will start to discuss the next part. Thanks, everyone.